greater instability, greater inequality, and I argued that this would ultimately lead by the end of the decade to greater instability across much of the developing world that was going to ultimately undermine the feasibility of neoliberal policy. Now, in the course of doing this research, though, rather serendipitously, I came across something quite unexpected. I went in, if you will, with this sort of dominant perspective at the time of what would have been the, those of us in development studies who would have been broadly on the left and with a critical view of neoliberalism. So I went in with that kind of approach, which was looking at how, in a way, developing countries were suffering as a result of this. But I was then started uncovering some curious anomalies. Now, the fact that neoliberal policy changes in developed countries since the starts with Margaret Thatcher in 1979, but of course the neoliberal revolution starts earlier in the developing world. And the first thoroughgoing experiment with state retreat is Chile after the overthrow of Salvador Allende in 1973. But even before that, in some African countries and in some Latin American countries, there's the beginning of these experiments with shutting down state enterprise, deregulating the economy, liberalizing trade, liberalizing currency regimes. And there was clearly these were leading to greater inequality, but the narrative that dominated, particularly in the 1990s, was it didn't matter because the rising tide would lift all boats. Everyone was going to be better off. And by the end of the 1990s in developed countries, that seemed to be the case. We seemed to have a weak counter-argument. Inequality was worse, but there was no evidence it was leading to greater discontent in places like the United States because incomes were rising across the board. Particularly at the end of the decade, 98, 99, there was a boom in the American economy, very similar to what's happening today in the United States, where you have rapid economic growth, rising real incomes, and yet inflation remained low. And this, of course, in standard economic theory shouldn't happen. If you're going to have a growth that goes that fast, you're going to have inflation ultimately. But inflation just remained flat. And so there was this talk increasingly widespread. This is the new paradigm. There's a lot of talk about this. We have created a whole new world, almost utopian. We've created a new world, and we're going to liberate all of humanity with this. And then, of course, you get the 1998 Asian crisis, which for a moment seems to upend all of this because you get a massive crash in the property markets in East Asia, which then ripples out across the world. And in the course of the year, you get the first big global crash since the Great Depression. But this proved very short-lived in the sense that a number of policy interventions were taken. I won't go into the details, but to stave off the crisis, although it did bring about 2 years of serious hardship in developing countries. It was at the end of the 1990s in most developing countries, other than China and India, at times of real austerity, declining GDP per capita, and yet rapid growth in the developed world. And so this was where I started to say there's a breach going on here. And what I did is I started digging deep into sort of data on financial flows, global financial flows. And what became apparent is that literally the boom at the end of the decade, particularly in the United States, literally is driven by the very fact that you get temporary decline in these developing countries is what's driving the rise, because there's a massive withdrawal of capital, because capital markets have been liberalized as a result of neoliberal policy changes. Everybody with money, and I was also picking this up anecdotally, talking to people in the business and the financial sector, who are sort of sotto voce, talking about the ways in which they're taking their local currency and putting it into their bank accounts in Miami, New York, and London, just getting it out of the country, but only until the crisis passed. But the result was that several $100 billion left the developing world and flooded primarily into the so-called flight to safety into the United States, going mostly into treasury bonds, which is what highly liquid capital tends to do in moments of crisis. Now, again, I won't bore you with the details of how this works, but the effect of when U.S. Treasury Okay. Now the effect is, so this is basically borrowing. It's borrowed by the U.S. government, and because so much money is flooding in, they're able to borrow at virtually free money. Now the effect was that this depressed interest rates. This had a number of effects, and I won't, as I say, I won't bore you with the economics because I don't think there are any economists here. But first of all, interest rates go down across the board because if the interest on federal debt goes down, banks don't have to compete by offering high interest rates. They can bring down interest rates, and that led to a big surge in consumption because effectively you're getting free money. Okay. Secondly, what it does is that American investors who have money in the stock market, including pension funds, there's a huge surge in value of stocks, so everybody's feeling richer. Okay. Third thing, you'll see where it comes together that this effect, because so much demand for US dollars now coming from around the world that this actually leads to an increase in the value of the dollar, and the effect of an increase in the value of the dollar is that it makes imports cheaper. And this is the same period, of course, that China is opening up to the world and flooding the world with cheap goods. They're cheap to begin with, they're becoming cheaper.
So it makes imports cheaper everywhere?
For the US.
For the US, okay, yeah.
And more generally for the developed countries, for Europe to a lesser degree, because there is some flight into EU, and there's also flight into Britain. But this is what I argued was, what I detected, what was driving the boom was this massive flood of money from the developing world. So the crisis in 98, 99 is a period of in some developing countries, of real hardship, and it's a time of tremendous prosperity, and they're literally, it's sort of, think of it as a seesaw. It's the very fact that one is going down that the other goes up. The problem is, of course, that means that eventually the seesaw is going to be balanced because those people are not taking their money out of Indonesia. These are rich Indonesians, by the way. This is not, by and large, American investors in Indonesia or in Korea or in South Africa, for that matter, because South Africa was affected badly in this particular crash. These are rich local people who are parking it in temporary instruments with the intention of bringing it back home once the crisis passes. So that seesaw is going to be balanced. And I foresaw this, and I predicted there was going to be a big crash. And lo and behold, I arrived in Washington to do a one-year fellowship at Georgetown University just as the dot-com bubble starts bursting. There's this crash. And that's what's happening. I then started, the financial flows are going in the opposite direction. And that has continued since.
What year did this start?
This started in 1999, in fact. This is what I found. And this is where the inquiry begins right here. Okay? That 1999, as far as I can tell, is the year in which the Western world peaks. Okay? In terms of its share of global economic output, peaks at 4/5. In the last 15 years, that's now fallen. With the last now going on 20 years, that's fallen to 3/5, and it's, relatively speaking, it's falling sharply. Okay. Now, in the event, what the United States central bank did, what Western central banks did after the dot-com crash, is they cut interest rates. They cut interest rates, and of course, the other thing that happened in the US is they greatly liberalized the mortgage market to make it easy, very easy, to buy property. That year I was in Washington, a friend of mine who had just bought her first house and said, "Oh, you should buy real estate. Everybody's buying real estate." I said, "Well, that's absurd. I'm not American." But she said, "Oh no, just buy it. You'll get rich. We're making money hand over fist." And I, out of curiosity, just picked up the phone and called the bank and said, I'm here for a year. I have an income paid in US dollars, and then I'm going back to Jamaica. But, maybe I'd like to buy a house when I'm here. Would you lend me money? He said, "Yes, absolutely, come in." It was that simple. That was basically the process. I mean, they were throwing money at borrowers, and you all know that's a whole story of the housing bubble. But my argument was that central banks said essentially what was happening, and this is the real issue. I then started going, well, let's look what is happening. And this is really what's happening. And in the rich countries on the top, and this is going back 30 years, I mean, it's a 30-year period, it's going back now 35 years, but the average annual growth rate had been trending down over time, whereas the developing countries have been trending up. Now, initially, and you still get people who say this is entirely a China effect, but it isn't. It isn't anymore. Okay, this is broad-based. Okay.
Broader than BRICS.
I'm sorry?
Broader than BRICS.
Much broader than BRICS, because remember, among the BRICS you have Brazil, which, as they say about Brazil, it's a country with a lot of potential, and it always will have a lot of potential. And Russia is, but India, China, and of course, last year the world's fastest growing economy, and 3 of the 10 fastest growing economies were in Africa. So very uneven performance in Africa because you still have, you still do have crisis-ridden economies, but the long-term prognosis for Bono doesn't look terribly good, right? Promoting this idea of a whole continent in crisis. In fact, that's another story for another day. And interestingly, just an aside, if you plot this, I chose this time period just because you have a perfect mirror image. In fact, if you take it all the way back to the early 60s, that decline had started setting in the developed countries as early as the 1960s. It wasn't apparent at the time because you had annual average growth rates of 5 and 6%, and if it goes down 1 year, and of course it's a high degree of variation. It's only over time that a trend line clearly emerges. But this secular decline, and this is not decline, this is decline in the growth rate, so it's growing more slowly, the economy's still growing. The developing countries have a very interesting curve. It's something like this. They actually, interestingly, after decolonization, contrary to the expectation at the time, developing countries actually went backwards relative to Western countries. The whole idea was that they would gain control of their economy and they could then now start to orient the economy more in an inward direction. And this would lead to the country keeping more of the gains of growth. In fact, the opposite happened. Okay, growth actually slowed in most, including China, in most countries in the 50s and 60s, most developing countries, as it accelerated post-war boom in the Western world. Now, the cause for that appears to be, from what I can tell, that there's a period of, there is an inward-looking period in many developing countries as essentially they're consolidating independence, they're building whole new states, they're increasing their administrative capacity. In some ways, what's happened in South Africa in the last quarter century, you can say, well, this is a similar process, that you have a massive expansion in the state's capacity, which is actually, in the short run or in the medium term, is not good for growth. But if, to the extent that you have functioning administration, and that's of course the problem that we have to deal with here in South Africa, is not all of it is functioning terribly well. But on the other hand, I also point out, in historical context, monumental corruption isn't in and of itself a sign of a state that is in decay, because during the period of rapid growth of the state, in virtually all countries, you do have monumental corruption. The United States in the late 19th century, well into the 20th century, urban politics is run by mafias. So, the kind of cast of characters we have here have parallels in U.S. history. Anyhow, and my argument, therefore, was the only thing left in Western countries to keep juicing growth was these bubbles, where you try to attract an influx of money by further lowering regulatory standards, cutting interest rates, what have you. Now, so I published this book in 2004, and I say, essentially I predict what the Western world faces is a long period of essentially, the underlying growth rate is going to remain, keep trending downward, averaging around 1 or 2%. And any periods of rapid growth are going to be caused by bubbles, which is going to cause crashes. And this book appears in 2004, just as the American housing boom is getting underway. And the same kind of narrative of the new paradigm, rapid growth, we found the elixir of eternal growth is emerging. And I guess I had the misfortune of publishing my book saying there's going to be a period of chronic slow growth punctured by crisis. In the same year that Alan Greenspan gave his famous, now infamous speech saying, well, he's analyzed the housing market, there's no reason to believe housing prices will ever fall in America again. All right. Now, I rely on Bungani to tell me what Davos looks like, because I didn't get the invitation Alan Greenspan did, but I do think I came off a bit better than the historical record. But, needless to say, we get the next crash, 2008, which accelerates this trend, right? That you see the fall in production that occurs in the OECD countries during the Great Crash is much less than in the developing countries. And in fact,